And now to introduce Dr. Mose. Dr. Peter N. Mose is a senior lecturer at the Department of Languages, Linguistics, and Literature at Kisii University in Kenya. He obtained his PhD in African languages from Rhodes University, South Africa, and also pursued his postdoctoral training from the same institution. His specialization is the intersection of language literacies, multilingualism, and language policies. His current research interest is the critical literacies/pedagogies and curriculum making in African languages. Dr. Mose is a member of professional language associations and currently an honorary senior research associate at Rhodes University's School of Languages and Literatures. He has published in the area of languages and literacies and has also presented research papers at international conferences both in Africa and the USA. Dr. Mose believes that championing for African languages is not merely a pan-Africanist anthem, but a campaign to remember the African soul, revalorize the African identity, and to revive and restore truly African ontologies and cosmologies based on our heritage and current realities. Dr. Mose, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for making time to interact in this, in this forum. I will delve into my primary identity, especially with regard to language, and say that my mother tongue is Ekegusi. Ekegusi is spoken in the western part of Kenya, just next to Lake Victoria. We neighbor the biggest lake in Africa, Lake Victoria. And so Ekegusi is a Bantu language. And I learned Swahili at school. I learned English at school. And English was the language of instruction at primary school, though teachers often explained their notes on the chalkboard in Gusii. You see, that is about in the late 80s, and today they still do the same thing. They have to teach in English, then they have to, let me call it short wave into Ekegusi, the language the children can understand. So in other words, a lot of the English is just lost because the children have not mastered the language to be able to study in it. And then, of course, so there is a lot of code switching in our classrooms, actually all the way through primary school. Research shows that. And then I wanted to speak about the language situation in Kenya. And I wanted to draw, because this is the foundation of my argument, that the language issue from as early as 1919 was a subject of the colonial decisions as well as missionary decisions, because initially when the missionaries came, they wanted to teach the people that we want you to be Christians, and there is a book here you need to read. So they taught them through the local languages. Actually, they were trained and able to read in the local languages. And the same people who were trained to read and write were used by the colonial governments for administration. As basic, the low cadre workers. Later on, English was enforced as a means of instruction before independence. You know, we got our independence in 1963 after several years of colonialism, and then there was there was a claim for independence. But I just wanted the audience to note that in Kenya we have an Indian set of people, quite a number of thousands, who settled here much earlier. And so in the schools, in the pre-independence and independence days, we had Indian schools and we had white schools and we had African schools. So by about 1940s to 50s, the policy now changed from indigenous languages as languages of instruction to English only. So, but the audience should note that with the enforcement of English was an enforcement of a culture, was an introduction of a culture of the speakers of English. So, and because the natives were told that if you can speak in English, then you are going to get a white collar job. White collar, yes. Then gradually the population, the indigenous people, because they saw that anybody who was able to speak in English would become a government officer, they would earn money, they would build a permanent house. Permanent house to mean a brick house or a stone house. And then they would put on shoes, which was a rare thing to have in this part of the world in the time. And then, of course, the population, the native population, saw something higher than themselves. Let me put "so" into quotes. They were made to see that their ways were a little bit inferior to the ways of the people who spoke a foreign tongue, English, and the people who also learned it and were able to speak it, both at home, both at workplace and perhaps sometimes at church, because the white people would go around preaching. At one point, the advisory committee of the colonial office said as follows, that there can be no doubt that one of the main incentives, if not the incentive of African parents in sending their sons to school, is for them to acquire a knowledge of English. A knowledge of English is naturally regarded by them. And I'm reading these words carefully because naturally regarded by them did not just happen as a natural process. They were made to regard it. And just note also that their sons, during this time, Africans were also suspicious that you take your children to school, they'll be taken away by the whites, so don't take them. So girls were not allowed to go to school. And so that's why they are using sons in this statement. Acquire knowledge of English, which is naturally regarded by them as the principal means whereby economic advancement can be obtained by them in later life. The audience should note that Africans had an economic system. They had barter trade, they had animals which they could sell and exchange it with other things. And so they had a robust economic system with their neighbors, with other tribes. Advancement. So in other words, this statement implies that the Africans had been made to think that their economic, political, and social structures needed to be re-engineered so that they aspire for something greater. Any attempt, therefore, to delay unduly the introduction of English into African schools would be regarded as the attempt of government to hold back the African from legitimate advance in civilization. Fellow scholars, and these sentiments are part of the foundation of perhaps what we people are undergoing as in the way we look at our languages, our foods, our clothing, our agricultural systems, our schooling systems, and what we regard to as true education. Now, I want to continue with that and say that in 1963, by the time we got independence from the British, the population had been thoroughly brainwashed to associate English, a knowledge of English, with civilization and the intelligence by both the educated and the uneducated. Kindly note that even today, about 70 years after independence, there are people who still think that when you speak in English at church, at political rallies, at community meetings, you are truly intelligent. So by independence, this was the thinking. The evidence I have for this is this. There was an education commission set up by the new government, the new African government. A Kenyan professor, Ominde, a native professor, and they were supposed to recommend on which languages should be used in schools now that we have got independence. Do you know they, alongside other recommendations, recommended that English should be used as a language of instruction from grade 1, since it was the only means that children could make progress across the curriculum. And I want to pause here and remember what current research says. The only means of allowing children master a second language is by saturating them in a context where the language is spoken generously. Second language theory says that. But here in 1963, we had a handful of white men who could speak in English, and a Kenyan professor's committee says English should be spoken from grade 1. And there is a guarantee that every African home had no English speaker at the time. So there was no generous input. There were no speakers of English so that children could learn from it. But what did the commission say about the beautiful languages which were being used 30 years before? Just in the 20s, in the 30s, the African languages were being used for literacy, for teaching the content knowledge in classrooms. These languages, all of a sudden, within 30 years, the professor says in his commission report, we see no case for assigning to them, that is the indigenous languages, a role for which they are ill-adapted, namely the role of educational medium in the critical early years of schooling. But you see, this also contradicts a UNESCO advisory given 10 years before, in 1953, that the best medium of instruction was mother tongue. But just in 1969, there was a research report by Stabler, in which a report is given that in the examination done just before independence, Africans and Indians performed poorly, both in English and across the curriculum. So the commission, actually Professor Ominde's commission, had also believed that our languages had miraculously turned from means of instruction in 1930, in 1930, to their inability to become languages of instruction. Prince Law says that just as there is a transfer of linguistic knowledge, there is a transfer of conceptual knowledge developed in the mother tongue. In other words, the mastering of complex, abstract, or academic concepts in an inadequately known second language is always problematic. But once mastered in the mother tongue, both concepts and vital cognitive skills transfer readily and are available for use in intellectually demanding contexts. So that commission recommended that an English was enforced across all public schools in teaching education. 1980, about 17 years after the recommendation, the National Examining Body observed that the level of spoken and written English in all walks of life is dropping every year. And this report must have been very factual because we did not have English speaker models. You know, the majority of the teachers in the Kenyan classrooms was Africans. And therefore, however, in school, students were being penalized for speaking in mother tongues within school compounds. Students, Ngugi has written this, but it is there today because I've written a paper on this. Students, even today, 70 years after, are beaten for speaking in their mother tongue. In 2023, a high school student was sent away, actually a Form 4 student. Form 4 is the last level before you write your national examination. That student in the last term of the year was sent away because she spoke in Dholuo. Dholuo is one of the major African languages in Kenya, before an education officer. So the principal sent her away for 2 weeks so that she comes back to write her exams and go home. So in 1980, this was happening. They were beaten or sent away or forced to put on a sack with a caption, "I am a donkey" or "I am stupid." Up to today, this happens. And fellow scholars, I want to use this to illustrate to us that a cultural assault systematically implemented actually completely destroys a people's self-esteem. And it does not take 1 month, it does not take 2 months, it takes generations to deal with this thing. Now, the corporal punishment and the public embarrassment was meant, and even today, 70 years after, is meant to reinforce the general philosophy of the colonizer that the African child's ways, that's culture, and language were and are still uncivilized and backward, and that they are needed to aspire towards a higher destiny, that of the English culture. Thiong'o explains this very well in page 3, paragraph 2 of Decolonizing the Mind. And he says, but the biggest weapon wielded and actually daily up to today, 2025, unleashed by imperialists against that collective defiance is the cultural bomb. The effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement, and it makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It makes them want to identify with that which is farthest removed from themselves. For instance, with other people's languages rather than their own. These words cannot be more truer. I see this every day because I'm a first account. I'm a first-hand witness of this. I see it in the public offices. I want to say this is not in my slide. One day I went to a public office here. The predominant language, over 70% of people in my county, Kisii County, speak in Kegusi. I went to a public office and I approached a native Kegusi speaker, asking him to offer me some service. And he was visibly annoyed with me. A young man of about 35, wondering why I can't speak in English. He didn't even ask me if I understand any English, so why am I speaking in a Kegusi? He was visibly annoyed with me, and this happens everywhere in the country. People have refused, they have distanced themselves with their beautiful mother tongues. So in the years just before and after independence, the population had significantly abhorred their heritage. And by adopting Christianity, they discarded, but this is not really completely, typical African ontology and epistemology. And by aspiring for English, they started a pursuit for something that would be unassailable but unattainable. Oh, this is by Neville Alexander, one of the foremost language experts in South Africa, who calls English unassailable but unattainable. So we have researched that effect. Perhaps we'll speak about it. So the generation of men and women in government today belong to children who attended school in the years just before and after independence. And these are the people we hope will bring language revolution. They are the people we believe will support efforts to bring to the center African ontologies and epistemologies. Now, what are the practices? This is just a general view because several of us know this. Generally, in Africa, we have language policies which insist that we teach in the languages children understand from grade 1 to about 3, grade 4. That's what the language policies say. In Tanzania, at least, African children can listen to teaching in Swahili. Though so many of them are not native Swahili, but because there is generous input, I know they are able to go through the education system in the early years. All other countries have early exit strategies of multilingual education. So by grade 3 or 4, children move to English only teaching. Now, there is evidence that in South Africa there is a wide-ranging, effort to center African languages in classrooms in predominantly African language settlement areas. Though the country faces challenges in implementation, including parents who want their children to be taught in English and who do not wish to identify with their mother tongues. There is that evidence. In Kenya, of course, my country, the policy stipulates that up to grade 3, children are supposed to study in their mother tongues, and then they transit to English from grade 4. But that policy is not adhered to the letter. And part of the reasons actually for that is that some of the teachers are ignorant of the policy itself. And then, of course, other reasons include teacher and the parental ignorance on second language learning and acquisition. Because they think that if the teacher teaches in English, if they teach in English, the children will know English by that method. But research tells us something different. And then there is lack of government commitment, and then the association of English with success in science and as a vehicle to social mobility. So researchers have indicated that this is a South African research report that is a threat to linguistic and cultural diversity because by insisting on English-only media of instruction, then you are pushing to the periphery the use of the other languages for teaching. It is a powerful factor in discrimination and exclusion, and surely that is so. And it disadvantages a large group of people, not only in South Africa, but everywhere in Africa. So the cultural subjugation of indigenous cultures was partly intended to create two tiers, a superior imperial tier and a lesser one that would forever aspire to a higher one. Anyone, therefore, without English is in their default tier, discriminated, excluded, and disadvantaged. And in many Anglophone countries in Africa, we know that a knowledge of English is encouraged at all levels. And however, there is a wide use and a growth of African languages across Africa, especially on media. And this should be an opportunity for their development. I listen to my local media in my language of 1.5 million people, Ekegusi. We have about 5 radio stations and another 5 TV stations, all broadcasting in Ekegusi, and they discuss environment, they discuss politics, they discuss education, they discuss culture and the religion using those languages. And I keep wondering, what is this that English is able to do that my mother tongue is not able to do? Because if it is politics, we are able to discuss it. Environmental conservation, we discuss that. Family, religion, and all that. And sporting and the rest. Now, I need to move a little quickly now. Then, what curriculums are we using in the schools? Because I have attended conferences. I attended one in Georgia. I attended one in Pittsburgh in April this year. I have attended several in Africa, and there is always an anthem that let us use our African languages. But the question I asked myself, which curriculums are we implementing? Which syllabuses are we implementing in Africa, in African languages? And actually, this is the reason why my title is Interrogating the Foundation. The foundation of centering our African languages and cultures lies in the curriculum and in the syllabuses and in their implementation. Now, so there are no detailed African language curriculums and syllabuses in many countries, including mine. The model that exists, the models of curriculums which exist are copies from the English model. And because of, some of you, I know, perhaps have a background on African language structures, you will know that the method of teaching an African language must be different from the one we use to teach Indo-European languages. Then, so in Kenya, we have a curriculum for Swahili, and Tanzania, I know we have, and in South Africa, we have Xhosa, and a few other places, you know. In Kenya, you know, teachers are told, we don't have a curriculum for mother tongues, use the one in Swahili or in English. Use that curriculum and the syllabuses to teach your mother tongue. Then you can see the casual attitude towards the teaching of and using African languages to teach content knowledge continues to contribute to the colonial masters' scheme to alienate their former colonizer from their true identity, heritage, and worldview. So, in other words, we don't have a curriculum we can say this is a truly African curriculum. Then, this guidance is another lost opportunity to entrench African indigenous knowledges, heritages, idioms, and the metaverse into the education system and among African children. Fellow scholars, in my culture, among my people, in the early 1900s, our people were able to conduct surgery of the brain. And the people we have clips, we have photos of those activities taken by even the white people on how if somebody had an injury in their head, the traditional medicine men could do a surgery of the skull and use traditional herbs, and these people would live a normal life for the rest of their lives. And several other types of diseases in the culture. So how do we account for the loss of such a rich heritage of knowledge, of medicine, at a time we had not interacted with the white people? Then, in the indigenous language textbooks, the textbooks that we are using, some publishers have done textbooks in our languages, like in Ekegusi. You look at those books, what they have are folk tales, basic grammars, and oral literary elements, and therefore nothing touches on the big things about what African ontology and philosophy and epistemology and our heritage has been. Because we have had a rich socio-political, educational, and cultural system, a spiritual system, a worship system, which was rich. And I know there are leftovers of this in several parts of Africa. But we don't see this in the books that we are using in the schools, the books that are being published. Then, of course, one outcome of these books that do not engage learners on their immediate realities is a continued socialization into foreign realities which are far removed from their consumers. You see, fellow scholars, when we continue using foreign metaphor and idiom, in the form of English, we are not living in England or the British Isles, so we are not able to update these children because languages and cultures are dynamic. We are just picking fragments of their culture and teaching them, but they live in a different cultural reality. So Alexander says that, unfortunately, of course, this is the reason why this happens. The new elite, black and white, the ones educated in the 70s and 80s, is prepared to do no more than pay lip service to the promotion of multilingualism or the development of the African and other marginalized languages. The new elitism in practice are quite comfortable with simply taking over the colonial state, but allowing everything in essence to remain the same. That is Neville Alexander still on that subject. Then how do we teach the African languages? You know, in Kenya, Swahili is taught, you know, Swahili is taught as a subject up to Form 4, and it's also a career language in universities. People can publish in it and do quite a bit of that. So, but a meaningful development of African languages should use both languages as language of instruction and teach them as languages. Why? If we use them as languages of instruction across the curriculum, we will be intellectualizing them, because that process will generate technical and scientific terminology in those languages. I wrote a paper in the South African Journal of African Languages in 2020. I went to the books, textbooks of science from grade 1, 2, and 3, and picked out the core words, the technical terms. And do you know that, to my amazement, of course I used to know this, but that research showed me that we do not miss a word, a vocabulary for scientific terms at grade 0, grade 1 up to grade 3. We have all the words for animals, the words for agricultural terms, and all these. So if we use them as languages of instruction, that is what we do. If we use them as subjects, then of course we will be able to create a pool of knowledge to make learners communicate, negotiate knowledge, be creative, make imaginations, and express themselves through poetry and song and drama. So in many countries, of course, what we have, for example, in my country, is code switching. That is the closest they come to using those languages as means of instruction. But you know, the irony of that is that it is teachers acknowledging that English is not working, but let us teach it, but then make our learners understand using the languages they speak at home. So in Kenya, we don't have a systematic teaching of our languages, both as, we don't use them as means of teaching, neither do we teach them as languages. Then, of course, in principle, the languages are not used as media of instruction across the curriculum, except in instances of code switching. Then there are no known African country language textbooks at all levels that teach African beliefs and the indigenous knowledge systems. E.g., what I said, that they will see people's brain surgery skills, farming systems, environmental preservation practices, rainmaking skills, and even ancient Egyptian mathematical knowledge. We don't have African language books, which as part of their curriculum speak about these things and explain how it used to happen, because we are people who can share this knowledge. So African overall, do not have sustainable literacies in African languages. So my second last slide there, I hope to make this quickly. We must decolonize our African language curricula and entrench critical literacy teaching in African languages. Now, let me say this quickly, that in decolonizing the curriculum, let's not only say that we just remove a few fragments from our subjects. We need to let African realities, heritages, histories, religious expressions be foregrounded. If they can't foreground them, then let them make it part of the topics in the various subjects. These aspects can be used as illustrations across all subjects, including in languages. The predominance of Eurocentric idiom and metaphor in books works against a truly African epistemology and ontology. I look at my books in social studies in grade 4 and 5 and 6 in Kenya, and you see a lot of, they are littered, sorry for using that word, please. They are littered with English idiom, English metaphor, English examples, and you wonder, why are you teaching them something far removed from themselves? Then why can't we have foreign concepts be used in comparison with where Africans are coming from? Because they are a full house ontology. They don't need, there is no deficit. We don't have a deficit in worldview. We don't have a deficit of our history. Though I read a quote of a former immediate French president who said that Africans are outside of history. Now, doing this is not a case of increasing the visibility, of course, of other languages and decreasing that of English. It is about developing and promoting some languages in order to create an appropriate, multilingual, and effective cognitive and intellectual environment. And also this applies to culture. We don't have a deficit of cultural heritage. And then let the teaching of any subject, especially African languages, be done to empower students to become change makers. You see, we have at Rhodes, because that's where I studied, there is a program that teaches medical students to be able to use Zulu, Xhosa at workplaces. But what about those students who drop out of school? We need a teaching of African languages, which should make students to ask who wrote the books they are reading. Why did the writer include or exclude some people from the book? Why were some themes left out? Why are some characters developed in particular ways? Let African language curriculums and syllabuses, the ones we want to entrench, we want to put into our schools and universities, let them be taught about justice. Let there be content on justice, on fairness, on discrimination, and be asked how they can participate in bringing change to society. According to Freire and Jans, we need to teach using African languages to radicalize, into quotes, to radicalize students to bring change into Africa. They should ask, why must we be taught in English? That is a political question. English is not, it was not created, it was not inherent. English does not inherently, not only English, please, but all the other exotic languages, they are not inherently superior to African languages. And then, of course, efforts to foreground African realities should acknowledge cultural synthesis affecting aspects of African culture, that is on food, on dress, on ICT, on religion and political systems. And of course, efforts should insist that typical African aspects still remain intact. You know, there is a thinking that Africa has become hybrid, you know, and that is true, of course, because we have copied through the media, through those of us who go out there and study and come back. And so we have quite a mosaic of cultures. But even that mosaic then should be a conglomeration of cultures, but the stem of that should be African realities. Ubuntu, for example, is opposed to Western individualism. African concepts on ethics, African ideas on family, African medicine, African spirituality are all items intact that can be used in teaching in our universities. I'm not sure if I need to do the last slide because my time is over and I feel a little bit, if you could give me 3 or so minutes, I'll make a comment on that last slide. Thomas?
Yeah, please go ahead. 3 minutes is fine.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. So in the process of decolonizing our curriculums and our teaching African ontology and epistemology is being sympathetic to the African child who lives within an African context and in daily encounter with local realities expressed in languages spoken at home and at the community. For majority of this, their mother tongues are the most ideal. When we entrench a truly African heritage and ontology in our education. We are being sympathetic, we are being realistic, because this is where the children live. The African child simply cannot be expected to verbalize his childhood experiences in a foreign language. Such a language may have no idiom for expressing his experiences. He cannot find words for the stories he wants to tell. He cannot explain the recreational games he plays. He cannot talk intelligibly about the ritualistic ceremonies he attends. Hence, he says either little or nothing when called upon to speak. In this way, his thinking is retarded. His imagination is dulled, his confidence is weakened, and his native wits remain unsharpened. But again, we need a sustained decolonial engagement with socio-political and social structures, since indigenous structures are understood best in African languages. Some African thinkers observe that there is more than enough resources to initiate and support African knowledge production. And with our experience from Western intellectual traditions and interactions, we can progressively promote African epistemological and ontological foundations based on our immediate realities. Actually, in my village, even when some of these people go to church on Sunday and on Saturday, there are some who still consult mediums at night. So there is a kind of a hybrid way of expressing their religious convictions. So we therefore must desist from applying European normativity in our knowledge production endeavors, and in this way free ourselves from apparent racist Eurocentric epistemologies. And finally, it looks insurmountable, but the Western intellectual thought and English developed through over 1,500 years from AD 450 has been developed across centuries from the days of classical philosophers to date, because there are scholars who say it is too late. But we can admit that let the colonial interruption, which interrupted us from 1880s, be treated as a pause and allow African ontology and epistemology thrive, however, in a hybrid version. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mose. Your incisive and impassioned speech gives me so much energy this morning on a Saturday. Thank you. I now invite you to be in dialogue with Professor Makoni. Prof. Makoni, the floor is yours.
Yes, I guess you want to remove the PowerPoint so that we can see each other.
Oh, sure, yes, that's correct. Let me just stop share there. All right.
Yes. Okay, thanks, Peter. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Do I read you correctly in saying that the main thrust of your argument really is not so much whether African kids are taught in African languages, etc., or not? That your main concern, your main area of interest is the issue of ontology, African ways of thinking and being. That what you are insisting we should think about is not so much that we should teach our kids in African languages or so. That is just a side issue. That the critical thing that you want us to apply our minds to is the need to sustain African ways of being and thinking, spirituality, etc. That is your main argument. And if that argument is valid, then I can see why you are saying you want to move, your argument moves beyond Ngugi, because your main concern is an ontological debate that you are trying to draw our attention to. Am I correct in reading you like that?
Yes, Prof, you are correct. But then I also believe that the best way to carry this ontology within ourselves and to the next generation is through the languages we speak.
Okay. Okay. So in a way, language here is just a way of getting through to the major, bigger issue of ontologies and ways of being. That's what is the argument. That's where you are going with this. Right.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. If that argument is valid, then what I'm interested in is if we were to leave the classroom and move to, let's say, local newspapers, uh, local churches, etc. What is the status of African languages or local languages in local radio stations, local newspapers? Because are you saying that the classroom it does not necessarily reflect how local languages are used and practiced in, let's say, in churches, in newspapers, etc.? In what way is the world of the classroom reflective of how these African languages are used in other domains? Mm-hmm.
Well, now there is a mismatch between what happens in the classroom and how these languages are being used outside. Let me illustrate.
Okay.
We have in my small language, we have 5 radio stations that broadcast the whole day from 5 in the morning to the next 5 in the morning tomorrow.
Yes.
We have call-in programs where the listeners call in and ask questions and debate issues of politics, issues of science, issues of education.
Yes.
And in my view,
yes.
the same people who want their children to be taught in English are so free to debate issues, weight issues of that affect the community about environmental preservation, politics, education, religion, freely in their mother tongue. So the school is moving at a slower pace, and the community users of our languages are faster than the classroom.
Okay. Now the question that is there, that's very interesting. Why is there this schizophrenic tendencies that you have aptly captured, that when they are engaged with the local radio station, they are discussing local politics, government, elections, corruption, etc. They freely use these local languages. But the same group of people, when their kids go to school, are likely to be advocates that those kids should learn anything. What is it about the nature of African education that is so alienating that the African wants to behave differently in school from the way they behave outside? Do you see what I mean? What is it about? Is it a question of liminality? Is it a question of, what is it about that phase between the school and the other areas of African life that are so much out of sync that the African has to live in multiple worlds at the same time? The same person who goes to church and sings in Kikusu and Kiswahili, but would argue that they want their kids to be taught in English. What is it about that those ideologies that are in conflict? And how do we get around that particular problem?
Yes, 2 questions there. Now, to the first question on why this exists, my thinking has been that it is because we do not know, and actually we don't expect the men and women in the village to understand this. And I think I have come to understand this because I have gone through the school system, and more specifically because I studied language. There are professors in this country who will argue vehemently against African languages. It is because they do not understand the epistemic significance of teaching children in a language from known to unknown. So I attribute that problem to that lack of information on how languages work, how they are learned, and how they are used. Otherwise, on the other hand, these people are proud to speak in their mother tongue, to express
Yes.
themselves in the easiest language they know, which actually
Yes.
underscores the fact that people can function best if they are using a language they know best. Let me remember
Yes.
what Mose Mandela, the late
Yes.
Mandela, said, that if you speak to a man in a language in a language they understand, you speak to their head. If you speak to them in the
Yes.
language they know, you speak to their hearts. So in
Yes.
my view, these people who are very excited to speak and debate on TV and on radio in their mother tongue are actually living how naturally people live when they are speaking in a language they know best from their hearts.
Yes. 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 This is then I should know this. Can you give me just a short historical background of the use of local languages in Kenyan media? You gave a very incisive account historically about the historical developments of the Kenyan educational system. And I'm just curious to know, running parallel to the changes in the educational system, were there changes in the languages used in the newspapers? Let's say if you go back, if you had time and you were to go back to the 1990s, where you started, and you were to look at the newspapers in Kenya, what languages were they written in? Did they change across historical space and time? What happened in the world of the written print?
Now, written print has been dominated by English, the national newspapers. And we have one newspaper written in Swahili called Taifa Leo, which is the nation today. So in my language, in the early 1990s, there was a newspaper called The Voice of Gusii. Gusii is the region where the Kisii people come from.
Yes, yes.
Then it disappeared somewhere in between. And I would attribute that to the poor readership of indigenous language publications. But let me also draw your attention to readership of Ekegusi, written materials. The Bible is written in Ekegusi, and we have several versions of that. You would almost find a Bible in every home of Ekegusi speaking people. And so children are taught to read the Bible in Ekegusi. And using the reading abilities in Swahili and English, they are able to read in Ekegusi because they are not taught a lot of that in school. So on what change came on the use of Ekegusi in public spaces started in the early 2000s when there was a liberalization of the communication institutions like TV and radio. The government allowed the radio business and TV business to several people who applied for permits. And actually from 2000, there has been a wide, the 5 radio stations I spoke about are private. There are 2 other government radio stations broadcasting in Ekegusi, my language. So, and this also applies to Gikuyu, it applies to Luo, to Akamba, to all of them. They have not less than 5 radio stations and 5 TV stations, all broadcasting, playing music, everything in those languages. So you can see the mismatch. We don't have a readership except the Bible, but we also have a robust use of these languages on the media, including on TikTok. Now, today we have TikTok clips done in Ekegusi, and they are very popular among the people.
Yes. Thanks a lot. So I have, this is my last observation. There's a part of me that is said about the situation. Then there's a part of me that is a bit more optimistic. The sad part of it is the lack of changes in the educational system. But the more optimistic part, I think, is built on what you are saying, the radio stations, which are in Kigyosi and all the things like that. And in TikTok, in Kigyosi, it's more or less like there are multiple worlds the African communities find themselves in. In some cases, some changes are really taking place. In others, it's like sociolinguistic archaeology, things are at a standstill. I must say, Peter, thanks a lot for this fascinating presentation. This has been very exciting to me. Let me hand over to Ian, and I think there may be a number of people who want to jump in. Right. Ian, thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you, Makoni. Let's start with a question from Katalin, who mentions using the local languages in education in localities where people share the same language is fine. What happens in urban contexts where people come from all parts of the country and children do not necessarily share L1s in the classroom? Which mother tongue is used in the classroom then?
I should respond to that, I think.
Oh, yes. Sorry, that's towards
Okay.
you, Dr. Mose.
All
Thank
right,
you.
all right. Thank you. Thank you. What a good question, because we should expect such a question. You see, in the country's education policy, children in towns are supposed to be taught in Swahili, which is a national language. And almost every home in these towns are able to speak in Swahili. But again, let me put this across as well, that a mother tongue does not necessarily mean the language the mother of the child speaks. It is the language the child knew first. The child they are able to express themselves in, the language they play with, the language they can understand, the language they can read. So it could be Sheng for some it is Swahili, for some it is Kegusi, for some it is Akamba and the others.
Yeah, absolutely. And then actually, Katalin wrote a follow-up during your exchange with Makoni saying that promoting multilingualism in education is inter alia a political issue. It appears, however, that the political elite across much of Africa does not seem to be interested in working for the benefit of the people. This seems to be as much of a hurdle as the legacy of colonialism. In fact, this attitude is the legacy of colonialism. Seems more like a comment. We also have a. Oh, go ahead. We also have a question from Chisom. Dr. Mose, thank you for your presentation. You made a crucial point about the economic power of English during the colonial period, that it convinced local Kenyans that attempts to teach them in their indigenous languages were attempts to hold them back. This was the same case with my people, the Igbo of Nigeria. My question is, this point still holds till date. English has immense economic power and access, which is the place of economic factor in the argument you're making. People, I believe, aren't likely to be convinced to your argument based on sudden pride in their languages and epistemologies. I think people tend to be more pragmatic and may take up this argument if it shows them that it can as well uplift them economically. So what do you think about this relationship between, I guess, languages and the political economy?
Right, good question. Now, let me say this, and I want to use the media. Politicians interact with their people in the languages they speak. Do you know that every politician, the members of parliament, members of local county offices, senators and the governors, did you know that some of them are experts in their own fields, lawyers, businessmen, men with degrees. Do you know when they come back to to ask to be elected, when they are campaigning, they are campaigning using their mother tongues. They are speaking to the people using the language the masses understand. That is one. So if somebody wants to become a member of parliament, they are going to use their mother tongue to convince their people to give them a job. That is how they are interacting with their people. And through that, they are going to earn an income. Secondly, the men and the women who are doing TikTok videos, they are doing those TikTok videos using the mother tongue, and through that they are getting an income through it. Those who are doing drama, those who are writing books for like Bible translators, they are getting money using the knowledge they have from their mother tongue. So in other words, we still have an economic aspect of using our languages in our daily lives. Preachers, these who preach to the local churches, they are preaching using their mother tongues, and they are earning an income through that. So what is the difference if you are a preacher who speaks in English in town and they earn an income, and one who speaks in Ekegusi and they earn an income in the rural areas? It is the same thing. So African languages still have some aspect of economic empowerment depending on which profession somebody is going to work with. Those who do agricultural medicine and animal science, animal husbandry, they go through people's homes to inject cows and to vaccinate them. They interact with the owners using the local languages. And actually, even the government has realized this, and the men and women who are posted to local areas are men and women who can understand the local languages so that they are able to understand the problems farmers work with. Isn't that an economic aspect of the language?
Yeah, I think that goes back to your conversation with Makoni about this distinction between the educational context and also as discourse is occurring in the public spaces as well. Charlene asks, Dr. Mose, thank you for this refreshing presentation. We have almost exactly the same dilemma in schools as well as in education out of schools in the Caribbean, where English only is the language of literacy and the language of education. But the push by one indigenous nation within the Guyanese state is hopefully changing that. Under the leadership of one of the Caribbean's most skilled language planners, we have actually included mother tongue literacy in Wapichan only in the nursery schools in that region where the teachers have embraced this program. I do hope that your activism bears fruit in Kenya. And so our question is, do you think that the success of the Mau Mau rebellion in the 50s has caused this vicious erasure of Kenyan culture in education?
Well, Mau Mau was an uprising against the white man, majorly in the central part of Kenya, among the Gikuyu people. And from the history, we know that their efforts were part of the reason perhaps we got independence sooner in 1963. So I do not see a one-on-one connection between the activities of Mau Mau and the language issues that we are dealing with today. The only thing we could say is that if we could connect, because the Mau Mau came from the Agikuyu people and then Ngugi also came from the Mau Mau people, perhaps we could only associate the campaigns by Ngugi on African languages from the 70s through the 80s, through the 90s. We could actually say that his voice has echoed across these decades to date. That would be the most singular, person we can point a finger at as far as the language question is concerned.
All right, thank you. I'll get to Sally Coco next, but I also just wanted to share a quick question from Cecile, who says, thank you for your presentation. Could you please talk about the legacy of Ngugi in Kenya regarding his perspective on language?
All right, thank you very much. Now, let me just say that myself and two other colleagues from the Department of Languages and Linguistics at Kisii University have translated Decolonizing the Mind to Swahili. The manuscript is with the publisher, and we hope to have it published anytime within the next 6 months or so. Now, let me say that Ngugi's efforts and his writings have made a huge influence, especially among language experts, literary experts, language experts, and persons who teach in language departments in this country. Unfortunately, in the last decades of his life, he had no opportunity to speak when within the country, because you realize he came to the country about in the year 2000, and he did not stay for long. So his voice is heard from the diaspora. Nevertheless, people like us and those in language departments have heard him loud and clear. And perhaps his legacy will live beyond here. We have translated it, Colonizing the Mind. We don't know what somebody else is going to do with these other works. And in these small efforts, we hope that the message about decolonizing the mind through our languages and cultures might continue to the decades ahead of us.
Oh, thank you very much. Sally Coco, you're raising your hand.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mose, for everything you said. It's nice to learn that the situation in Kenya is not so different from that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I came from. But I'm curious, members of parliament during the parliamentary transactions, do they use indigenous languages? Do they feel free to use, say, Swahili, which is the major lingua franca, or any of the other languages, Kikuyu or Luo or what?
Can I respond, please?
Oh, yes, please go ahead.
That's why I asked the question.
Okay. Now, in Kenya, the two official languages we have are Swahili and English in official contexts. So in Kenya, while some are free to use English, some use Swahili in parliament. In the local assemblies, because some of the men and women are elected not on the basis of their ability to use their languages, there is a push now that they be allowed, because the local assemblies are within a language area. For instance, in Kisii, we have a county assembly, and all the members representing local wards are Ekegusi speaking people. Now there is a push from language experts and even the people themselves that why can they be allowed within those spaces to debate and present their bills in Ekegusi, then the translators can put them in English, the official language for record purposes. So in summary, Swahili is allowed, and some speak it in parliament in Nairobi, and the others speak it in the local assemblies. And then there is this third push for the use of the legislation to allow them use languages they are able to use within their local assemblies.
Okay. Now, when the president speaks to the population through the media, does he use English or Swahili?
In Kenya, and depending on where he is, he uses three languages: English, Swahili, and his native language. When our president goes to areas of where he comes from, that is in Eldoret in Kenya, he speaks to them. If it is a public gathering, he could speak to them as part of his speech in the language of that locality. If he comes to Kisii, in which in which the people do not understand Kalenjin, he speaks to us in Swahili. Occasionally, if he's giving a national address, he could give it in English, then of course make a few comments in Swahili. It's a trilingual shift.
Do you think that the contents of the message remains the same regardless of whether you speak Swahili or English? Or is the Swahili version diluted?
Now, the difference is that when he speaks in English, it is the elite who get his message. And because he acknowledges this, he often would switch to Swahili and to the local language, depending on which part of the country he is speaking to.
Yeah, that part I got it. But regarding the contents of the message, does the contents remain the same when he speaks in Swahili or in his mother tongue, ethnic language?
I would say that in principle, it is the same thing. For instance, if he's speaking about if he wants to discourage people from tribalism, or if he encourages people to work hard, he would still speak the same thing in the next language, except just a few variations here and there. Yes.
Yeah. So, given these changes in the Kenyan political life, why is there reluctance to use indigenous languages in all levels of education, of formal education? Why can't professors at the university try to convey, to teach their classes in Swahili, for instance, which is quite widespread and everybody speaks it? Why don't professors at a university try to teach in Swahili?
Now, the professors in language and linguistics who have interaction with the literature on language and linguistics use the language. But I also want to bring this to your attention that the professors do not allow their children to go to the local primary school where Ekegusi or Swahili is used to teach. They would rather their children go to international schools, then they have opportunities in Europe and Australia and the United States.
Yeah, well, that's the contradiction. That's the contradiction in the system that should be questioned and definitely changed, because in reality, the ruling class is working, to maintain the privileges inherited from the colonial tradition. And it's like, it works if you can find a job abroad, and I have benefited from that, and of us here. But we don't care for the rest of the population. And the economy, you can connect it to the economy. Our economic development consists of service economy, where not for the people, but for the global north. And so we are reluctant to use our languages in certain domains because we fear that the global north wouldn't be able to communicate with us. But really, if the global north needs our raw materials and so forth, it wouldn't be too difficult for them to learn the local languages. So, but we don't want to put ourselves in that situation where we say, well, domestic matters first before international matters. Our languages first before European languages. And in a way, it is a contradiction with regard to independence, where the colonial language continues to function as an official language. It should keep the status of foreign language and not official language. Now over 60 years since independence, I don't see this change happening. Isn't that one of the things that we should be fighting against? Or are we intellectuals complicit in deriving our benefits from the use of a foreign language rather than from the use of a national language? you have an opinion?
Yes. Well, Prof, there are quite significant contradictions, and I would attribute this to what Ngugi calls the cultural bomb. We have been made through the education system to think that English or any other foreign language, French, Chinese, Portuguese, is a gateway to opportunities. And politicians and people who have gone to school know that if your child can speak in Chinese, then they can get a job in Shanghai, China. If they speak in French, they can work in Paris. If they speak in English, they can survive and work in the United States and Canada. So this is something that got deep into us, so that we have, it has almost become impossible for us to unchain ourselves from this way of thinking, even when we have evidence just next to us that our languages can carry knowledge, they can carry technical terms, because French, English, Chinese, Portuguese, Germany are not inherently superior to African languages. They have been developed. English for almost 1,000 and more years has been developing. We have read about the history of English, first period, second period, and the modern period, through which English has grown. And through the time, they have borrowed vocabulary, they have borrowed syntactic patterns and all this. And today, we almost forget that that is the history English has gone through. So I would say, Prof, in short, that in my view, it is the effect, that cultural bomb that was used to destroy our culture has left the effects several years down the line to date. Because even the conversation about decolonizing African languages, decolonizing curriculums, is just a recent one. Why have we not been complaining about this from 1950s up to 2000? Because from 2000, I don't see any papers, a lot of papers from African universities speaking about decolonizing curriculums. Just the other day, about 10 years ago, is when South Africa started decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing languages, decolonizing everything. So you see how we believed in the white man's way of thinking for all those years from 1950 up to 2000. That is when we are starting, roads must fall, fees must fall, the white man must fall, we must remove English from our classrooms. Why was that silence for 50 years? In my view, it is that bomb really hit us hard. It convinced us that Africa is a lesser being. His ways of thinking, his heritage, his religion is inferior to that of the white man. That's my thinking for now.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. We have Charlene. You were talking about a professor earlier. Charlene says those professors sound like gollywogs to me, which is a very interesting word I've never heard before, but it sounds like it's not flattering.
Right.
She also asked another question, which is, you were talking about bilingualism and multilingualism in the classroom. What is your vision about how bilingualism or multilingualism looks like in the classroom?
All right. Now, in Kenyan classrooms, we have cases where you go to class near Kisii town, and you have 60 students, you have 50 Ekeusi speaking students, and you have 10 students from another ethnic community who do not speak Ekeusi. One form of bilingualism is to, if you are describing a concept, you explain it in the language the 50 can understand. And then for the 10, you use Swahili, which most likely they understand, for them to understand. Another pattern within the African context is code switching. You teach in English, then you make a summary of what you taught in Swahili, for instance, which is a language that every child could understand in a town school. For example, in Kisii town, where where students from across the country would be in one class. So translanguaging and code switching would be the most ideal forms of using different language forms in a single classroom. And actually, that is what is most common, because teachers would always do notes. They would do the presentation in English, they write notes in English. Then in the last 10 minutes, a teacher would go back and say, this is what I said, this is what this means, this is what this implies, and then they summarize their lessons. And by that way, then you could realize that quite a few students would get the contents of the lesson.
Great, thank you. Now we have Chisom has a hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mose. I kind of picked up on what you were saying about English, that people perceive English and other European languages to have economic power, but they do have economic power. When you go to school and you learn and study English or French, you move up. People see that it works. And so that is why I don't really understand. I just feel like I don't understand what your argument is, who it is directed to. Are you advocating for ordinary people in the street to a sort of individual responsibility to take up pride in indigenous languages and epistemologies, when a lot could be done by the very people in power to put institutions in place where the languages and epistemologies you talk about, their domains of usage could be expanded? I don't really understand who your argument is directed to. Is it to the people or to the people who are in power? Exactly. Who are we expecting to take a substantive action to turn around these things? Because I feel like we've been going around in circles about this decolonizing argument. And I feel like it's about time people move that argument from cultural or pride to the economic aspect of it, because that is where it can be showed to work. When people see that whatever you're talking about can impact the money in my pocket, they tend to buy into it more. So I really want to understand what your point is and who it's directed to in this context.
Right. That's quite an interesting angle to look at it. You see, our argument is directed at policymakers, the men and the women who make policies and those who implement them. Why? Because we know that there are children who do not finish school because of lack of school fees, maybe because of change of family circumstances, or for whatever reason. What we are saying, if they stop schooling by grade 6, they will most likely lose their ability to use English outside in the world. But if they were educated in the language they understand and speak, if they understand the economy, politics, social life through their mother tongue, they will be able to earn a livelihood when they go out there. So they will practice agriculture, they will understand what church is preaching, they will be able to sell their vegetable and eggs in the market and make a living. So we are saying, what about those people who are not going to study English until they finish high school, until they get a degree in college, until they go to the United States to work? We have several others who drop in between. What is the fallback? If they were able to read and write in their mother tongues, they will be able to earn a living from their rural areas through business activities and other creative endeavors. Number two, if experts understand English, for example, in South Africa, they are teaching medical officers and other experts on how to speak and use their mother tongues in hospital and in other workplaces. Why would you want to train somebody who does not understand their mother tongue and then you send them to a local hospital where a local language is spoken? And yet, this person who comes to hospital only speaks their mother tongue. how is this doctor going to be able to understand what this person is suffering from and administer proper medicine? So in other words, we are speaking to policymakers and the men and the women who give out resources for the development of these languages with the argument that there is a political, there is an economic, there is a social, there is a religious angle to the development of African languages, that they are important to the extent that millions of Kenyans are not fluent in English. There must be a solution to the fact that these men and women look for public services in offices which use English. And then if they are not, if we do not have people who serve people in public offices who know these languages, how are we going to offer public services? That is our argument.
I'm appreciating this very rich discussion so far. I would like to be mindful of time. We have a couple of more questions from Christine and Cliff, and both are related to multilingualism and education. We also have Charlene and Eric with their hands raised, and so I hope that we can continue this conversation on this thread within the unmoderated after party. But before we make that transition, Makoni, do you have any sort of final thoughts before we stop the recording?
No, I don't, except to say to Peter, thank you very much for this animated presentation. And I think it's very useful because it enables us to focus on the situation in Kenya. And like everybody was saying, that then we then try and compare with other contexts. Like yesterday, we were in Vietnam, now we are in Kenya, and I think it is those comparative contextual analyses which are quite enriching. And again, thank you for the work that you are doing on Googie. The question that I would like to ask, for example, is what is the other work that you guys are, what else are you working on in terms of the work that was done by Ngugi? You said you had finished translating Decolonizing the Mind. What else are you planning to do?
Well, there is a group of other language scholars who wish that after this publication, we will pick another of his works, because he had actually given permission before he passed on, that the publisher would allow us continue translating his other works. So that is still what we will be keen to do. And alongside that, we want to look at classic works from African writers which speak to our realities today and engage with further translation and, publicizing them.
Okay, then just on that, when you were translating Decolonizing the Mind into Kikosi, what were the issues that came up? What were the challenges and what were the interesting aspects that came to your mind as part of that project? What did you learn and what were the problems that came up as you went through it?
Well, it was an exciting project, trying to see how this work would come out. A few challenges were the how to render some expressions into Swahili, and so which of course made us to look for the closest terminologies that would render the thought intended. Occasionally, we would put into brackets an expression that would be, closer to the one that we have picked, and then, of course, compare this with this as a way of helping the reader to actually make sense of what Ngugi was saying in English.
Okay, yes. Okay, good. Right. You have got one that was translated into Shona.
Yes, I've seen that, but I can't read Shona, so I know there is one that
I should. Now, that's the question that I was going to ask. The assumption here is that you're translating this into these local languages, and those individuals can read those local languages. Right. It will be interesting for me. I can't read Shona. It's supposed to be my first language. I'll be very much keen to try and read Ngugi in Shona when I don't understand Shona. When I can't read Shona, so it will be a very interesting experience in that way. Anyway, it will be like learning my own language through Ngugi. It will be an interesting experience. Okay, thank you very much for this. Okay, yeah, no, I wanted to conclude through this conversation by getting us back to some of the work that Peter and his colleagues are doing on Google. Thank you very much for this exciting work. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mose. Thank you, Prof. Makoni.
Right.